The council expected complaints, demands, maybe even threats. Instead, the human ambassador stood up, spoke 9 calm words, and every human walked out. No protest, no warning, just absence. Within hours, the galaxy discovered how much of it had been quietly held together by hands that were no longer there. For decades, the humans had attended every session, listened to every accusation, and signed agreements that benefited everyone except themselves. They repaired trade lanes others damaged, stabilized systems they did not control, and mediated conflicts that were never theirs to begin with. The Council called it cooperation. Humanity called it responsibility. Neither side admitted how dependent the galaxy had quietly become. When the sanctions were announced, most delegates expected outrage. Economic restrictions, technology access revoked, transit limitations enforced. It was meant to remind humanity of its place. The chamber prepared for argument, for negotiation, for emotional reaction. Instead, the human ambassador simply acknowledged the decision, expressed gratitude for the years of cooperation, and declared that humanity would respect the Council's wishes completely. They did not ask for reconsideration. They did not offer compromise. They did not threaten consequences. They left. At first, the chamber interpreted the silence as surrender. Some leaders expressed satisfaction. Others called it inevitable. Humanity had always been adaptable, they said. Humanity would return when reality forced them to. The session concluded with procedural efficiency and polite confidence that order had been maintained. The first disruption occurred less than 2 hours later. A major interstellar trade corridor reported navigation instability. Automated correction. Systems failed to compensate. Emergency requests were sent through standard channels, but the human maintenance network that had quietly managed those corrections for years no longer responded. It was assumed to be a technical delay. Then communication relays began to lag across multiple sectors. Not failure, degradation. Small delays, minor inconsistencies. Individually insignificant, collectively alarming. Diagnostics revealed no damage, no attack, no malfunction. Only the absence of a support architecture most systems had long stopped recognizing as external. Within 6 hours, logistical coordination across Council space showed measurable decline. Cargo routing inefficiencies multiplied. Predictive conflict. Modeling lost accuracy. Environmental stabilization programs in fragile colonies began drifting beyond safe tolerance margins. Each problem appeared manageable in isolation. Together they formed a pattern no one had prepared for. The realization arrived slowly, then all at once. Humanity had not been participating in the system. Humanity had been sustaining it. Emergency sessions were called. Delegates demanded explanations. Analysts reviewed infrastructure dependencies and discovered layers of human oversight embedded so deeply into galactic operations that removal produced cascading imbalance. None of it violated Council regulations. None of it required permission. It had simply existed because humans had chosen to help. And now they had chosen to stop. Official communication requests were transmitted to human space. They were acknowledged. They were logged. They were not answered. No hostility. No aggression. Only distance. For the first time in recorded Council history, silence became a strategic force. The chamber that had expected protest now faced something far more unsettling. A galaxy continuing to function, but no longer held together by those who understood how fragile it truly was. In the first 24 hours, the Council treated the disruption as a temporary systems imbalance. Technical committees were formed, audits were ordered, and infrastructure teams were reassigned to cover the functions humans had quietly maintained for decades. The assumption was simple. Whatever work humanity had been doing could be replicated through proper allocation of resources. It was an administrative problem, not a structural one. That assumption lasted until the first full diagnostic reports arrived. The Citadel's life support optimization protocols had been stabilized for years by unofficial human patchwork layered over obsolete core systems. No record of those modifications existed in official archives. Without them, atmospheric balance fluctuations began appearing across multiple habitat tiers. Environmental controls still functioned, but with declining efficiency and rising resource cost. Maintenance crews could observe the symptoms, but not the underlying logic that had prevented them. What had once been silent stability revealed itself as borrowed equilibrium. Trade networks experienced similar degradation. Cargo distribution algorithms that most species believed were council standard turned out to be human-designed. Frameworks voluntarily shared decades earlier and subsequently integrated without documentation of origin. Without ongoing human calibration, the algorithms still process shipments, but with increasing delay, misallocation, and waste. Economic analysts reported a measurable drop in interstellar efficiency across sectors that had shown perfect consistency for nearly half a century. Medical networks began reporting shortages next. Several alien hospitals had relied on human volunteer specialists during previous biological crises. These personnel had never been formally assigned. They had simply appeared when needed. Their absence exposed gaps in cross-species treatment. Protocols that no official medical body had developed independently. Records revealed that numerous emergency procedures credited to Council cooperation had in practice depended on human research contributions that had never been formally attributed. As evidence accumulated, the narrative within the Council shifted from inconvenience to unease. Humanity had not withdrawn forcefully. They had not sabotaged infrastructure. They had simply ceased participation, and systems that had long appeared self-sustaining began to reveal how many hidden supports had quietly been human in origin. The Council had not lost a member species. It had lost an invisible foundation. Senior arbitrator Talvershaw initiated a comprehensive review of all human grievance records submitted over the previous 42 years. The archive contained thousands of entries documenting trade imbalances, intellectual property disputes, labor valuation disparities, and repeated requests for procedural reform. Each grievance had been acknowledged in formal language. None had produced meaningful structural change. The pattern that emerged was not conflict, but endurance, a species continuing to contribute, while documenting every inequity with increasing precision and decreasing expectation of resolution. Simultaneously, diplomatic envoys were dispatched to re-establish dialogue. Human response protocols remained consistent across all channels. Messages were received. Requests were logged. No negotiation frameworks were proposed. No conditions were issued. Humanity did not demand revision of sanctions or reinstatement of privileges. Their silence carried no visible hostility, yet it denied the Council a familiar structure of dispute resolution. Without demands, there could be no bargaining. Without negotiation, there could be no procedural control. Within 3 days, several independent systems reported secondary failures linked to outdated infrastructure humans had once maintained voluntarily. Navigation beacons in remote sectors drifted from synchronization. Environmental monitoring stations transmitted incomplete data. Resource forecasting models began diverging from physical supply realities. None of these disruptions constituted crisis individually, but together they produced a gradual erosion of predictability across Council space. The psychological impact proved more destabilizing than the technical failures. For generations, the Council had assumed that cooperation was maintained through treaties, regulations, and economic incentives. Humanity's withdrawal demonstrated a different truth. Cooperation had also depended on voluntary effort that could not be legislated or replaced through authority. The absence of that voluntary layer created uncertainty. No procedural framework had been designed to address dot by the end of the first week. The Council confronted a realization it could not publicly articulate. Humanity had not abandoned the galactic system. Humanity had withdrawn trust from it, and trust had been the component no one had measured because no one had believed it could disappear. When the emergency session concluded, no resolution was declared. Technical teams continued their work. Diplomats continued their outreach, and official statements emphasized stability. Yet beneath every policy discussion and infrastructure report lay a single unspoken conclusion growing steadily clearer. The galaxy was still functioning, but it was no longer certain it knew how. The task force, assembled to study humanity's departure, met in a windowless chamber designed for technical review rather than political debate. 14 representatives attended, selected not for influence but for proximity to the problem. Economic analysts, infrastructure specialists, legal scholars, and one cultural observer who had lived among humans for 3 years. That observer, Lizanti of the Melian species, possessed the rare qualification of familiarity rather than theory, which made her both essential and largely ignored. Her assignment was to produce a comprehensive cultural profile explaining why a species would sever diplomatic ties without issuing demands. The request itself revealed the Council's assumptions. Departure, in their experience, was always a negotiation tactic. Silence was expected to precede pressure, not replace it. Lizanti's early reports challenged that framework. She argued that humanity's withdrawal was not an attempt to gain leverage, but the conclusion of a prolonged evaluation process that had ended in disengagement. The distinction was subtle but fundamental. Negotiation implies expectation. Disengagement implies resolution. She began her analysis with observations drawn from daily interaction. Humans, unlike most council species, maintain social structures. Independent and formal hierarchy. They gathered in informal groups without procedural purpose, creating bonds not tied to trade, security, or governance. These gatherings produced resilience that did not depend on institutional recognition. When denied formal influence, humans redirected effort into voluntary cooperation networks that operated beneath official awareness. What the Council interpreted as compliance had often been parallel development. Lizanti documented numerous examples of this pattern. Maintenance technicians who repaired environmental systems outside assigned duty hours because failure would inconvenience strangers they had never met. Medical volunteers who traveled across jurisdictional boundaries during epidemics despite lacking formal authorization. Engineers who developed optimization software and released it publicly rather than seeking recognition. None of these actions generated political leverage. They generated stability, which the Council accepted without examining its origin. Her analysis extended beyond behavior into emotional structure. Melian perception allowed her species to detect composite emotional states rather than singular signals. Most Council species expressed one dominant emotional condition at a time, producing clear and predictable responses. Humans exhibited layered emotional signatures that combined contradictory elements without resolving them. Concern coexisted with determination, frustration with patience, disappointment with continued effort. This internal complexity allowed humans to endure imbalance far longer than species that required emotional equilibrium to function. According to Lizanti's observations, that complexity had changed in the months preceding withdrawal. The layered emotional pattern had simplified, not into anger or aggression, but into something quieter and more final. She described it as a transition from negotiation to closure. Humans had continued fulfilling obligations while internally disengaging from expectation of reciprocity. The decision to withdraw, therefore, did not represent a reaction. It represented the external confirmation of an internal conclusion reached earlier that the task force requested. Measurable indicators supporting this interpretation. Lazanti provided records of declining grievance complexity over time. Early human filings contained detailed proposals for reform. Later submissions consisted primarily of documentation without recommendation. The final entries acknowledged council responses without requesting action. This progression suggested a species moving from advocacy to observation and from observation to acceptance. While the task force debated interpretation, external developments reinforced her conclusions. Infrastructure failures continued to emerge not as catastrophic breakdowns, but as accumulating inefficiencies. Economic projections showed increased operational costs across multiple sectors, none individually severe yet collectively significant. Trade routes remained active, but required greater resource expenditure to maintain previous performance levels. The system was functioning, but with diminishing margin. Diplomatic envoys returned with consistent reports. Human representatives remained accessible, polite, and procedurally correct. They acknowledged communications, confirmed receipt of proposals, and declined to reopen formal negotiations. When asked what conditions might restore engagement, responses remained unchanged. Humanity was not seeking revised terms. Humanity was operating independently. 6 weeks after the withdrawal, the Council's internal discourse shifted from interpretation to consequence. Analysts began modeling long-term outcomes, assuming permanent human absence. Initial projections predicted manageable disruption followed by structural adaptation. Subsequent revisions produced less stable forecasts. Systems optimized around voluntary participation could be redesigned, but at significant cost and extended timeframe. More concerning was the realization that many human contributions had not been formalized precisely because they had not been required by treaty. Their absence could not be remedied through enforcement. Lazanti completed the preliminary draft of her cultural profile and delivered it to the task force. Her conclusion was concise. Humanity had not withdrawn to change the relationship. Humanity had withdrawn because, from their perspective, the relationship had already ended. The Council had not recognized the moment it ceased to function because its structure had continued operating. Humans had recognized it because their participation depended not on structure, but on meaning. The report circulated through internal channels without official response. Procedural bodies requested further analysis, economic projections, and legal review. Each request treated the withdrawal as a condition to be managed rather than a judgment to be understood. Lazanti observed this pattern without surprise. The Council systems had been built to resolve conflict, not to confront indifference. Outside the chamber, the Citadel continued its operations. Ships arrived and departed. Trade negotiations proceeded. Maintenance crews adjusted to new workloads. Nothing in visible space reflected collapse. Yet across Council infrastructure, an intangible shift persisted. Processes once sustained by assumption now required verification. Cooperation once presumed now required justification. Stability had not been lost. It had become deliberate, and deliberate stability demanded effort. By the end of the 6th week, the Council faced a quiet transformation no resolution had addressed. Humanity had left without creating a vacuum. They had revealed one that had always existed, concealed only by their willingness to fill it. 3 months after humanity's withdrawal, the Council's confidence had not collapsed, but it had thinned into something brittle. Emergency protocols remained active across multiple sectors, yet no single crisis justified their continuation. Instead, a pattern of persistent strain defined daily operations. Systems functioned, trade moved, and infrastructure held, but always with reduced margin and increasing cost. The galaxy had not broken. It had become inefficient in ways that could no longer be ignored. Economic projections revealed the most measurable consequences. Trade flows remained stable in volume but not in reliability. Delays multiplied across routes once considered routine. Resource distribution required constant manual correction where automated optimization had once sufficed. Markets adjusted, but adjustment consumed capital, time, and trust. Analysts reported a growing divergence between expected performance and actual outcome across sectors that had shown consistent equilibrium for decades. One of the most significant developments emerged from the Varsian Trade Combine. Its chief economic strategist, Doyan Kethamaro, initiated an independent audit of interstellar logistics after observing irregularities in high-value shipping corridors. His models predicted that human absence should have produced temporary disruption followed by redistribution of responsibility. Instead, the disruption expanded proportionally with each attempt to compensate for it. Replacement systems replicated structure but not function. The audit uncovered an uncomfortable pattern. Numerous logistical frameworks credited to Council. Engineering originated from human designs, voluntarily shared without formal attribution. These frameworks had not merely supplemented infrastructure. They had corrected deficiencies in legacy systems no governing body had chosen to modernize. Their integration had been gradual, unofficial, and largely unacknowledged. Without continuous human calibration, performance degraded toward the limitations of the original architecture. Kathamaru authorized a strategic response consistent with established economic doctrine. If a withdrawn participant retained dependence on shared supply chains, pressure could restore engagement. Varsian-controlled mineral shipments to several human colonies were suspended. The decision was calculated to create scarcity without open hostility, encouraging negotiation while preserving procedural legitimacy. Historically, such measures had produced predictable outcomes. The outcome did not occur. Human colonial systems, ACTIVAT, the alternative supply networks that had not appeared in any council registry. Independent extraction operations in peripheral regions began exporting refined materials. Synthetic substitutes replaced several restricted imports. Bilateral trade agreements formed with minor civilizations outside Central Council jurisdiction. The expected economic contraction within human space did not materialize. Instead, regional trade reoriented along pathways that bypassed Varsian infrastructure entirely. Within 2 weeks, the blockade's strategic effect reversed. Markets that had relied on Varsian exclusivity encountered competition from emerging human-aligned supply chains. Several smaller species, observing the shift, began re-evaluating their own dependence on centralized trade mechanisms. Withdrawals from certain council agreements followed, not as coordinated protest but as independent calculation. Economic relationships built on inevitability were revealed to be optional. The Council interpreted these developments with increasing concern. Humanity's departure had been presented as disengagement, not expansion. Yet the formation of parallel systems indicated preparation rather than reaction. Evidence accumulated that alternative infrastructure had been developed gradually over several years. Withdrawal had not triggered independence. Independence had enabled withdrawal. Simultaneously, internal reform discussions intensified. Senior arbitrator Talver Show proposed suspension of the existing charter framework pending structural review. Her argument did not center on policy error, but on systemic imbalance. For decades, participation had been measured in compliance with regulation rather than contribution to stability. Humanity's absence demonstrated that regulation alone could not sustain cooperation where voluntary investment had once existed. Debate within the chamber grew more direct than tradition allowed. Some delegations advocated restoration of engagement through concession. Others argued that independence demonstrated human ambition incompatible with collective governance. Military advisors raised the possibility that disengagement might conceal strategic consolidation. None of these positions produced consensus. Each reflected uncertainty about a relationship no longer defined by shared structure. Outside formal proceedings, quieter developments suggested a different trajectory. A small group of species initiated direct communication channels with human representatives independent of council authority. These exchanges produced limited agreements focused on technical cooperation rather than political reintegration. The council did not formally oppose such actions, but neither did it endorse them. Authority without influence proved difficult to assert. Within human space, observable conditions remained consistent. No mobilization, no territorial expansion, no public declarations of grievance. Human communication maintained procedural civility while declining institutional participation. The absence of hostility complicated interpretation. A conflict could be negotiated or resisted. Indifference offered no leverage. Talvershow concluded her proposal with a statement that circulated widely despite lacking formal adoption. A system may survive the loss of a member, she wrote, but it cannot survive the discovery that its stability depended on contributions it neither recognized nor valued. Reform undertaken for preservation must begin with recognition of what was lost and why it was given freely in the first place. The chamber received the statement without official comment. Yet its implication lingered across deliberations that followed. Humanity had not removed itself from the galactic structure through force or demand. It had simply ceased to provide what it had once offered without condition. The Council now faced a reality no charter had anticipated. A community that remained intact in form while uncertain in substance thawed as the fourth month began. A new signal appeared at the edge of Council monitoring range. It carried no message, no identification, and no request. It remained active, constant, and silent. Technical analysis confirmed only that the transmission originated from beyond the established boundary of human space and that it maintained a stable open frequency. The Council debated whether to respond. No resolution was reached. The signal continued to exist without interpretation, an unanswered presence, neither invitation nor warning. For a political body accustomed to meaning, embedded in every exchange, the absence of stated intent proved uniquely disquieting. The galaxy continued to function. Ships traveled established routes. Markets adjusted to altered flows. Diplomatic channels remained open. Yet beneath these continuities lay a transformation that could not be reversed through procedure alone. Humanity had not declared separation as conflict. It had enacted it as completion, leaving the Council to confront a system that still operated, but no longer understood the terms on which it had once depended. By the beginning of the fifth month, the Council no longer debated whether humanity's withdrawal had consequences. The question had shifted to whether those consequences could be contained. Administrative continuity masked growing structural fatigue. Systems still functioned, but each function required increased supervision, and supervision demanded resources that could not be indefinitely expanded. Stability had become an active process rather than a natural state. The unidentified signal beyond monitored space persisted without variation. Its frequency did not drift. Its energy signature did not degrade. It transmitted no data, yet its existence consumed analysis across multiple scientific bodies. Some interpreted it as a navigational marker. Others classified it as an observational beacon. A minority proposed a simpler explanation. It existed solely to be noticed. The Council could not confirm any interpretation, and so the signal remained categorized as neutral presence, a designation that resolved nothing. Meanwhile, economic adaptation accelerated beyond institutional control. Peripheral systems that had once relied on centralized arbitration began forming localized agreements structured for efficiency rather than compliance. These agreements lacked ceremonial recognition but achieved measurable results. Transit delays decreased along routes that bypassed traditional oversight. Resource allocation became more responsive where fewer layers mediated exchange. The pattern did not represent rebellion. It represented optimization in the absence of dependence. Talvershaw's reform proposal, initially received with procedural distance, gained reluctant relevance. Committees tasked with reviewing infrastructure discovered that numerous foundational systems had been calibrated over time through informal human consultation. These calibrations were never recorded as essential contributions because they had been offered without request and implemented without ceremony. Their absence revealed how much stability had relied on adjustments no charter had mandated. Military advisories continued to evaluate the possibility of concealed human mobilization. Surveillance detected no fleet concentration, no expansion of defensive perimeters, no strategic redeployment. Human space displayed a consistent profile, self-contained, operationally efficient, and externally neutral. The lack of demonstrable threat complicated arguments for confrontation. A power that neither advanced nor retreated could not be engaged. Through conventional doctrine, diplomatic overtures were attempted through indirect channels. Several minor civilizations requested permission to relay inquiries regarding potential re-engagement frameworks. Humanity responded with acknowledgments of receipt and expressions of goodwill toward continued coexistence. No proposals were accepted. No negotiations were initiated. The tone remained courteous, the position unchanged. Cooperation, where it occurred, was specific and limited, never institutional. Within the council chamber, discourse evolved from strategic to philosophical. Delegates examined the premise that unity required central authority. Historical precedent had long supported this belief. Yet the emerging network of decentralized agreements challenged it. Order persisted in multiple forms simultaneously, some structured, some informal, all functional. The Council's authority had not been rejected through declaration. It had been bypassed through sufficiency. The Varsian combine, confronting, sustained market contraction, rescinded its earlier trade suspension without public acknowledgement of failure. Supply routes reopened, but former exclusivity could not be restored. Competitors had established permanent presence. Economic influence, once assumed to be inherent, now required negotiation. This outcome produced a realization that extended beyond commerce. Leverage diminishes when alternatives exist. Analysis of the persistent signal reached an unexpected conclusion during a routine energy variance scan. Researchers determined that the transmission incorporated a modulation pattern identical to a calibration protocol once used in early interspecies communication arrays. The protocol had been designed to maintain synchronization among disparate systems without imposing control. Its function was simple: ensure that different structures could operate in compatible alignment if they chose to connect. The discovery did not confirm human origin, yet its implication resonated. The signal did not command response. It enabled possibility, a presence that neither demanded nor withdrew, offering alignment without expectation, mirrored a principle many delegates recognized only in retrospect. Humanity had once provided stability not through dominance or obligation, but through voluntary compatibility. Talvershaw addressed the chamber for what would become her final formal statement on the matter. She did not propose reconciliation as necessity or independence as threat. Instead, she reframed the Council's predicament in operational terms. A system, she argued, must decide whether it exists to preserve its structure or to sustain the conditions that make structure meaningful. If stability had been supported by contributions freely given, then restoration could not be compelled. It could only be merited. Her words did not produce immediate policy. They altered the vocabulary of deliberation. Discussion shifted from restoring control to understanding interdependence. The Council authorized a comprehensive review of participation frameworks, focusing not on compliance metrics but on reciprocal value. It was an administrative decision, measured and procedural, yet it marked the first action motivated by recognition rather than reaction. The silent signal continued to transmit. After extended debate, the Council resolved to acknowledge its presence through a simple broadcast, a declaration of awareness and willingness to engage without condition. The message contained no request and no demand. It offered only readiness. For dialogue should dialogue be desired. No reply arrived. The signal did not change. Yet its constancy no longer produced only unease. It suggested a possibility the Council had not previously considered, that stability need not be imposed to exist, and that influence might emerge not from authority, but from alignment freely chosen. Humanity remained outside the chamber, neither adversary nor subject, a participant in the galaxy on terms it had defined by absence. The Council continued its work within a structure that endured, now aware that endurance alone did not constitute unity. The future would not be determined by who commanded participation, but by who created conditions worth joining. The galaxy had not broken. It had adjusted to a truth revealed in silence. Cooperation offered without recognition can be withdrawn without conflict, and when it is, every system must decide what it truly depends on. In the weeks following the Council's broadcast of conditional readiness, internal procedures began to change in ways too subtle to announce, yet too consistent to ignore. Oversight bodies revised evaluation criteria, prioritizing resilience over uniformity. Compliance reports were rewritten to include measures of adaptive capacity, rather than simple adherence to standard protocols. The revisions did not alter authority on paper, but they altered how authority functioned in practice. The network of decentralized agreements continued to expand across peripheral regions. These arrangements were no longer temporary solutions to disrupted trade. They evolved into durable frameworks that balanced autonomy with coordination. Systems that once competed for Council recognition discovered that mutual compatibility provided more immediate benefits than formal endorsement. The Council's registries recorded these developments without formally validating them, creating an unusual condition in which influence persisted outside official acknowledgement. Scientific committees redirected attention toward compatibility engineering. Rather than restoring systems to previous configurations, researchers began designing interfaces capable of integrating with multiple operational models. The shift reflected an emerging consensus. Stability achieved through flexibility could endure disruptions that rigid structures could not. This approach did not reject centralized governance. It supplemented it with a recognition that durability required optional alignment rather than mandatory conformity. The persistent signal remained unchanged, yet its interpretation evolved. Analysts who once sought its origin began to study its effect. Observatories noted that systems which adjusted their communication arrays to match the signal's calibration experienced reduced synchronization errors in long-distance data transfer. The phenomenon was modest but measurable. No directive instructed adoption of the calibration, yet several research installations implemented it voluntarily. They reported improved interoperability without any loss of autonomy. Military assessments grew increasingly restrained. The absence of hostile mobilization from human space compelled strategic doctrine to reconsider definitions of power. A force that exerted influence through withdrawal rather than expansion, did not conform to established threat models. Defensive readiness remained in place, but its rationale shifted from anticipation of conflict to preservation of internal coherence. Security was reframed as continuity rather than deterrence. Within diplomatic circles, a gradual recalibration of language took place. Communications no longer emphasized restoration of previous arrangements. They spoke instead of coexistence among distinct but compatible systems. The rhetorical adjustment did not produce immediate results, yet it allowed dialogue to occur without presuming hierarchy. Several minor civilizations adopted similar phrasing in their external relations, citing increased clarity and reduced friction in negotiations. Economic indicators revealed a paradoxical pattern. Aggregate trade volumes stabilized at a level below historical peaks, yet distribution efficiency improved. Supply chains shortened, redundancies decreased. The overall system processed fewer transactions while achieving comparable outcomes. Economists describe the change as contraction with optimization, a configuration that challenged long-standing assumptions about growth as the sole measure of health. Talvershow, observing these developments from her advisory post, compiled a comprehensive analysis of post-withdrawal adaptation. A report concluded that the Council's most significant transformation was not structural but conceptual. Authority had begun to function as coordination rather than control. Participation was increasingly defined by compatibility of purpose, rather than obligation to framework. The report did not claim that this transition was complete. It asserted only that it had begun. In response, the Council authorized an experimental initiative, a voluntary alignment protocol allowing member systems to adopt shared standards without binding enforcement. Participation would be documented but not mandated. The initiative represented an attempt to formalize a principle already emerging organically across the network. Its adoption was uneven, yet each implementation provided data supporting the viability of cooperative autonomy. The unidentified signal continued its silent transmission beyond monitored space. Its constancy no longer produced urgency. It functioned as a reference point, a reminder that alignment could exist without command. The Council did not attempt further contact. It maintained the broadcast of readiness, not as invitation, but as affirmation of posture. Human space remained self-contained and externally neutral. Reports indicated ongoing internal development focused on sustainability and interoperability, though details were limited. Observers noted no effort to expand influence, yet influence manifested indirectly wherever systems adopted compatibility over dependence. Humanity's absence persisted as presence, defined by example rather than engagement. By the end of the cycle, the Council chamber operated with restored procedural confidence, though not with restored assumptions. Stability had returned in form, but its foundation had shifted. The structure endured, now supported by an understanding that unity could not be imposed indefinitely, and that influence did not require proximity. The galaxy had not reverted to its prior state. It had adapted to a condition in which cooperation was meaningful only when it remained voluntary, and authority remained effective only when it fostered alignment rather than demanded it. The signal endured. The Council endured. And between them existed a space defined not by control or withdrawal, but by the possibility that systems, distinct yet compatible, could coexist without compulsion. The voluntary alignment protocol produced results that no formal decree could have achieved. Systems that adopted it reported smoother data exchange, fewer jurisdictional disputes, and a noticeable reduction in procedural delays. Participation remained optional, yet adoption increased steadily because its benefits were practical rather than ideological. The Council observed that cooperation rooted in utility proved more stable than obedience rooted in authority. Trade networks adapted. Further, shifting from dependency chains to cooperative clusters. Instead of routing all transactions through central verification hubs, regional systems verified one another through shared standards. This change reduced bottlenecks and eliminated several long-standing vulnerabilities. Economic stability no longer depended on uninterrupted oversight from the Council's core systems. Stability emerged from distributed reliability. Diplomatic relations reflected a similar transformation. Negotiations between civilizations began to emphasize compatibility of goals instead of alignment with a single framework. Agreements grew shorter, more specific, and easier to implement. Observers noted that disputes declined not because differences vanished, but because systems no longer required universal agreement to function together. Coexistence became procedural rather than philosophical. Military command structures underwent a quieter evolution. Strategic planning shifted toward preservation of operational independence within cooperative defense arrangements. Joint exercises no longer aimed to standardize tactics completely. They focused on ensuring that distinct forces could coordinate when necessary without surrendering autonomy. Defense doctrine redefined strength as the capacity to remain functional without centralized command. Scientific institutions documented these changes with increasing clarity. Comparative models demonstrated that adaptable networks recovered from disruption significantly faster than rigid hierarchies. The conclusion was not revolutionary, yet its confirmation across multiple sectors produced a gradual intellectual consensus. Stability, they determined, was not the absence of change, but the ability to integrate change without collapse. The Council Chamber, once the unquestioned center of galactic governance, assumed a different role. It became a coordinating forum rather than a commanding authority. Sessions focused on compatibility metrics, shared research, and crisis communication, rather than enforcement of uniform policy. The transformation occurred without formal declaration, recognized through practice rather than proclamation. Talvershaw's subsequent advisory memorandum summarized the progression with careful restraint. She described the current state as systemic equilibrium achieved through voluntary coherence. The phrase circulated widely among academic and administrative circles. It did not resolve debates about authority, but it provided language to describe a reality already visible across the network. The persistent signal continued to broadcast unchanged, neither intensifying nor fading. Its significance evolved from mystery to reference. Systems aligned their communication arrays with its calibration not out of obligation, but because it enhanced interoperability. The signal exerted influence without issuing instruction, demonstrating a form of presence that required no assertion. Human space remained distant and silent. No diplomatic missions arrived. No official commentary emerged. Yet reports confirmed ongoing internal development emphasizing sustainability, resilience, and compatibility across independent systems. Observers concluded that humanity had not withdrawn from the galaxy's future. It had simply chosen not to define that future for others. By the close of the cycle, the galaxy functioned with renewed stability built upon distributed cooperation. The Council endured as a nexus of coordination, no longer sustained by authority alone, but by relevance. Systems interacted not because they were required to, but because compatibility made interaction beneficial. The transformation was neither complete nor reversible. It represented an adaptation to a new understanding of order. Silence persisted at the boundaries of monitored space. It was not an absence of activity, but a condition in which influence no longer required visibility. The galaxy had learned to operate without dependence on a single center. And in that distributed quiet, continuity proved stronger than control. The human colonies, though removed from galactic oversight, thrived in ways that the Council had neither anticipated nor accounted for. Supply chains functioned seamlessly, networks of knowledge and logistics more efficient than anything previously, orchestrated under council rules. Each colony leveraged the parallel systems humanity had quietly built over decades: independent navigation grids, localized production centers, and autonomous medical and scientific facilities. The redundancy was meticulous, planned with the foresight of a civilization that knew the galaxy could not be trusted to prioritize their survival or their work. Council observers, those who were allowed access to reports filtered through independent channels, began to realize that humanity had not abandoned responsibility. They had merely redefined it. Where the Council had relied on humans for technical labor, engineering, and crisis management, humanity now relied on itself and its own network. Problems that would have previously triggered Council intervention, collapsed trade routes, epidemics, or environmental failures, were solved locally, rapidly, and often invisibly. For the first time in generations, humans operated without expectation of acknowledgement. Back within Council space, the absence of humans became a mirror reflecting centuries of neglect and oversight. Talvershow, still presiding over the diminished chamber, observed not anger or chaos, but a growing recalibration. Species accustomed to measuring success by their influence over humanity began to feel the consequences of that dependency. The infrastructure gaps, the logistic failures, the sudden drop in seamless trade, all underscored the invisible labor humans had contributed. It was not revenge. It was accountability manifest in absence. Meanwhile, the human leadership, embodied by figures like Commander Rael Vasquez, focused on consolidation and long-term resilience. The Carthage cruised through space like a silent sentinel, ensuring that colonies were equipped, that supplies were balanced, that medicine and knowledge flowed where needed. Every decision was weighed against survival, autonomy, and self-determination. Diplomacy no longer meant appeasing others, but safeguarding the integrity of human systems. It was quiet power, operational efficiency, and strategic patience, a stark contrast to the performative negotiations of the council chambers. Through all this, humanity never sent a single formal message demanding recognition or compliance. The galaxy watched and measured impact, not words. And in that vacuum, the subtlety of human strategy became its most formidable weapon. The Council could no longer rely on precedent or policy. They had underestimated a civilization that had mastered not just technology, but patience, resilience, and the quiet assertion of value. The lesson unfolded slowly, painfully for those who had once dismissed humans as furniture. The galaxy learned, step by step, that influence could exist in absence, that power need not be broadcast to be absolute, and that respect earned, not granted, was a currency far more consequential than any treaty, alliance, or sanction. Humanity had withdrawn, yes, but in doing so, it had rewritten the rules of engagement for every species. Every system, every council member who ever assumed control came from authority rather than competence. The silence was not empty. It was the hum of a galaxy adjusting to a new equilibrium, one shaped not by the strongest or the loudest, but by those who had quietly been holding it together all along. Months passed, and the ripple effects of humanity's withdrawal became impossible to ignore. The Council, once a sprawling machine of bureaucracy and protocol, now staggered under the weight of missing expertise, unacknowledged labor, and broken systems. Every department that had relied on human initiative, engineering, logistics, medical response, and even ceremonial observances struggled to adapt. There were meetings, reports, blame-shifting, and frantic calculations, but the solutions came slowly and imperfectly. Humanity had not only left, they had left the galaxy to see the true cost of taking them for granted. On the human side, colonies thrived in quiet contrast. What had been invisible labor for the Council became visible outcomes for the colonies. themselves. Navigational arrays operated flawlessly. Supply chains expanded, hospitals ran efficiently, and education and research programs flourished. The decentralized systems ensured no single point of failure could disrupt progress. Humans were not just surviving, they were excelling, proving that self-reliance could be more powerful than dependence cloaked in gratitude. Commander Rael Vasquez watched these developments from the Carthage, observing every data stream, every logistical simulation, and every report from distant colonies. She understood the subtle, devastating lesson that their absence had delivered. The galaxy had relied on them so thoroughly that they had forgotten to account for human autonomy. Humanity's power was no longer in treaties or votes. It was in infrastructure, in competence, in the unacknowledged contributions that now operated independently of anyone else's recognition. Meanwhile, the Council faced a crisis of legitimacy. Species that had once deferred to human diligence began to question their own assumptions about control and competence. When the Varsian blockade failed, when trade routes adjusted to human-operated networks beyond Council oversight, and when bilateral arrangements flourished with smaller, previously ignored species, the old hierarchies began to crumble. Authority no longer followed tradition or seniority. It followed effectiveness. Within this quiet revolution, Lizante Faye reflected on her work documenting human culture, their quiet generosity, their unique ability to harmonize contradictions within themselves. She had tried to explain to the Council that humans did not act for recognition or reward. They acted because they understood responsibility differently. Now, with the Council forced to witness the consequences firsthand, the wisdom she had tried to convey for decades was finally undeniable. Humans had taught the galaxy, in absence, a lesson that presence could never convey. In the end, the withdrawal became more than a political maneuver. It became a masterclass in strategy, patience, and respect. The galaxy learned that taking a civilization for granted came at a cost far higher than any treaty violation or economic sanction could ever impose. Humanity had left, but they had done so in such a way that their impact, their importance, and their quiet power were impossible to ignore. The galaxy had not seen them leave. It had seen the space they had always filled and now could not replicate. Years later, the galaxy remembered humanity not for the treaties they had signed, nor for the votes they had cast in council chambers, but for what they had quietly built, maintained, and nurtured. Colonies that had once depended on council-managed supply chains now operated independently, using systems designed, tested, and perfected by humans. Trade routes that had faltered under human absence were replaced with new networks faster, more resilient, and less reliant on centralized oversight. In the corridors of Citadel Station, silence lingered where humans once worked tirelessly, yet their influence remained embedded in every functional system. Diplomatic records were rewritten, budgets reevaluated, and treaties renegotiated, but the lesson was clear. Competence could not be ignored. Those who had treated humanity as furniture now found themselves scrambling to replicate infrastructure they had assumed would endure without attention. The galaxy had learned painfully that respect was not optional on the Carthage. Commander Rael Vasquez looked out over the stars, thermos in hand, knowing that every quiet effort her species had contributed over decades had been vindicated. The galaxy had underestimated humanity for 42 years. But it had also underestimated what a civilization could achieve when it stopped waiting for recognition. And somewhere in the quiet halls of a distant station, Lizante Faye flipped through the final pages of her cultural profile, her heart full, knowing that humanity's story of generosity, resilience, and quiet revolution would endure long after voices in council chambers had faded into history. The story closes with the simple truth: a species that gives without asking for credit, that acts without demanding recognition, ultimately shapes the galaxy in ways no power, treaty, or vote can match.